And the same thing between what's particularly seen as living versus non-living, or animate versus non-animate. That's an important distinction for some areas there, but they all are energy systems. They all contain these vibrant different amounts of energy and different kind of energy states, whether it's a rock that's 4.2 billion years old or a recently formed amoeba. They still, there's on this continuity. And that's again what I think that Brian Swimme does narrate so beautifully in the journey of the universe, is this from the very, very origins of the Great Flaring Forth or the Big Bang. There's been this differentiation of energy and matter in all these different configurations, and it's constantly moving towards greater and greater diversity of forms, greater complexity, greater creativity.
Welcome to the Journey of the Universe 10 Years Later podcast. My name is Sam King, and today I'm lucky to be joined by Dan Spencer. Dan Spencer is Professor Emeritus of Environmental Studies and taught at the University of Montana from 2002 to 2022. Some of his areas of teaching and research interests include ecological ethics, ethical issues in ecological restoration, ecology and religion, and globalization, justice, and environmental issues in Latin America and the global economy. He earned his BA in geology from Carleton College and master's and PhD in environmental ethics from Union Theological Seminary. In the 1980s, Professor Spencer focused on human rights issues in Latin America through his work as director of Latin American programs at the Center for Global Education at Augsburg College. He taught in the philosophy and religion department at Drake University for 10 years before relocating to Montana in 2002. He is the author of Gay and Gaia, Ethics, Ecology, and the Erotic, published by the Pilgrim Press in 1996. And in 2014, co-authored a book with Laura Stivers and Jim Martin Schramm, Earth Ethics, a Case Method Approach, available through Orbis Press. He is a longtime member of the American Academy of Religion and the Society for Ecological Restoration. Currently, Dan works with the Mike and Maureen Mansfield Center at the University of Montana, serving as academic director for the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, a U.S. State Department-funded program that brings 20 adult fellows from 11 Southeast Asian nations to Montana and Washington, D.C. to focus on environmental and natural resource management issues, as well as civic engagement and democracy. He lives in Missoula, Montana with his husband, Pat Burke, and especially enjoys time outdoors with their 3 grandchildren. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Sam. It's really a delight to be here.
It's a delight to be speaking with you. And as we start, I'm curious to hear a little bit about your origin story. How did you venture from studying geology as an undergraduate to later pursuing questions of ethics and the field of religion and ecology?
So I sometimes describe myself as a Minnesota boy who was born and raised in California. Both of my parents are from the Minnesota area. They grew up on farms, and I have a lot of family back there. But my mother hated Minnesota winters, and so she moved to California, and my dad joined her there. And so I'm one of 7 kids. I'm number 4 out of 7. Large Roman Catholic family, grew up in California, but really spent a lot of time all over the West in that area there. And one of the things we did as a family, we just camped a lot. We did a lot of camping trips. I did all the kind of the national parks and camped all over the West and there. And so all of us kids, the Spencer kids, grew up loving the outdoors, being really interested in that. And I developed a fascination for rocks and geology really early on. We had a family cabin near Mount Shasta in Northern California. It's in the crater of a volcano. And so the volcanoes were just something that fascinated me really early. I went to high school on the prairies of Colorado, but the Rocky Mountains right behind me there, and had a wonderful geological mentor there. So by the time I got to college, I just knew that that's what I wanted to do, was study geology. And Carleton College has a wonderful field-oriented geology program. It took me a lot of places on geology field trips there. In fact, it was really instrumental in part of my time in Montana, because I came to do geology field camp here in the summer of 1978 in the Tobacco Mountains, and then returned 2 more summers as an instructor in that camp. Then I also had 3 additional summers working in Glacier National Park here in Montana. So I had 7 summers in a row working in Montana, which really fell in love with this place here and shaped a lot about my story here. But the other thing that geology did for me is I really wanted to do international study abroad while I was in college, but I didn't want to just do the Europe trip kind of thing that people did. And so instead, I went to Costa Rica to study volcanoes in 1978. And the geology there was fantastic, but what really got me interested was Costa Rica at that time was being flooded by refugees from its neighboring countries of Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. All of them were embroiled in civil wars. And I got very, very interested in the human rights issues of what was going on in Central America, and was also struck by the fact that it was often the churches that were the ones who were really working with the refugees in Costa Rica. And so I graduated from college in 1979, and I decided to take a year off before I planned to continue in my geology studies. I studied geology there, but I wanted to take a year off to kind of address some of these questions. And I went to a place called Holden Village. It's a Lutheran ecumenical retreat center in the North Cascades of Washington State, and it's really an inholding in the Glacier Peak Wilderness area. It's a former little mining community, and now it's this ecumenical retreat center, and they focus a lot on social justice and kind of environmental themes. And that was really foundational for me. It was during that time there, I was applying to geology graduate schools, but I also had this thought, oh, maybe I should just take some time in seminary to kind of address these human rights questions that I've got going on here. And then the other thing that was going on for me, and this will weave back into my story in terms of why Junior the Universe is so important to me, but I was also really struggling internally with sexuality issues, trying to come to terms with being gay, but not having any resources for doing this. This is long before the internet, long before there was really kind of any information out there about homosexuality, other than a few things about it being an illness or a sickness or being illegal. And so I was doing a lot of internal struggle. At the same time, I was really wrestling with these human rights questions from Central America. And I happened to, it sounds a little dramatic now, but I kind of experienced it in a dramatic way. I had a kind of a Damascus Road moment while at Holden Village. They showed a little film about Dom Elder Câmara, the Roman Catholic bishop from Brazil, who'd been very involved in social justice issues. And the title of the film was called Excuse Me, America. And the point of the film was he came to this country and he met with people like Dorothy Day and Cesar Chavez and just really wonderful people. But his message was quite simple. He said, excuse me, America, your lifestyle of living in such affluence keeps my people in poverty. And it really just struck me to the core. And I kind of stood back and said, how can I just sort of continue a career in geology when there's all these world issues out there that are so important? So I decided I planned to attend seminary for 1 year to kind of get these human rights issues out of my system and then go on into geology. I was already accepted into a doctoral program in geology. But I took 1 year and I went to Union Theological Seminary in New York, which I knew had a strong record in social justice issues. The very first semester I was at Union, I had introduction to theology with James Cone, kind of the father of liberation theology. I had introduction to the Old Testament with Phyllis Tribble, one of the kind of founding foremothers of feminist biblical hermeneutics. I just had these extraordinary professors that just turned my world upside down. And I felt a lot out of place initially because I was studying with a lot of people who had studied religion and studied philosophy in their undergrad, and I'd studied geology. I was so new to all this material. But one of the things that was really advantageous about that was it allowed me to approach these issues from a brand new perspective. I just didn't have any preconceptions. I think partly also having grown up Roman Catholic, I had very little introduction to the Bible. And so I just ate this all up. And while I was at Union, it turned out that they had an exchange program with a seminary in Costa Rica, where I had been in 1978. And so I decided in my middle year there, to return to Costa Rica. I was there for 8 months in 1982, studying in the Latin American Biblical Seminary. So now I was really studying liberation theology among the people who were living it. We had students from 30 different countries in Latin America. And I spent my weekends on Saturdays volunteering to work with Salvadoran refugee kids who lived in the refugee camps there. And most of them had lost one or both parents in the civil war in El Salvador. And so that was, again, just one of those kind of experiences that just struck me to the core and really reshaped my worldview. So my initial plan to be at seminary for 1 year extended into 3 years. I finished with my Master's of Divinity in 1983. And I took that next year and went back to Holden Village and was a co-director of the Winter Studies program there, because I was so convicted by these issues that I wanted to have a chance to teach involved within a community that was receptive to this. And so that was a fantastic year being back there. At the same time, I had just started coming out as a gay man. And so when I went back to Holden, I had talked with the director of the village there, as an incredible mentor figure of mine, the Reverend John Schramm. And he said nobody had ever come out at Holden, but he thought it could be a good time. And so I came out as a gay man there. It was the first time that Holden had to struggle with somebody being in the community there who was self-identified as gay. But it gave me a whole year to work through those issues in community with people. And while I was at Holden, I met other people who were also passionately concerned about what was happening in Central America and liberation theology. And there was a group of us at Holden who decided at the end of that year that we wanted to start an intentional peace and justice community together. And we chose to do that in Minneapolis for a variety of reasons. We went back there and we started what became known as the Community of St. Martin. And it was a community dedicated to nonviolence and social justice. And as part of that, we had a hospitality house that welcomed people doing sanctuary from Central America fleeing that there. But that's where I began my work with the Center for Global Education. By now, I was fairly fluent in Spanish. I had a degree with a focus on liberation theology, and I was broadly familiar with Central America. So I spent 5 years helping to organize and lead travel seminars back to Central America to really focus on these issues. And what we were really trying to do was to help people understand the Central American reality through the eyes of the poor. It was a liberation theology approach. We were deeply influenced by Paulo Freire and his pedagogy of the oppressed and transformative education. But we just took hundreds of people over those years there. This was the time when the Reagan administration was supporting the Contras in their war in Nicaragua. They were supplying a lot of military aid to El Salvador. It was a terrible fratricidal war going on in Guatemala. We had U.S. troops all over Honduras. So it was a really fraught time. It was an absolutely fascinating time to be there. And I felt like I was doing really valuable work in helping to educate the U.S. public about what U.S. policy was there and what the poor were trying to do through the grassroots-based communities and liberation theology. So I did that for 5 years. And I knew during that time, all that time, at some point I wanted to teach at the college level, and that would require getting a PhD, getting a doctoral work. So in 1989, I decided to leave that work, and I went back to Union Theological Seminary to work on my PhD. Again, I had incredible mentors there. My advisor was Larry Rasmussen, who's been also deeply involved here with the Journey of the Universe series. I had James Cohn. Again, I was a TA for him in his classes. In fact, Raphael Warnock, who's running for Senate in Georgia, was one of my students in that class there with James Cohn. He was a student of James Cohn, and I was his TA. And then Beverly Harrison, who was just a phenomenal feminist ethicist and theologian, and several others. So it was, again, a really formative time. I had fantastic classmates with whom I'm still in touch and do really wonderful work. And with that time, was also all this journey gets intermeshed with the journey of being out as a gay man in the churches too. And there would have been progress made, but it still was a pretty closed environment. And in fact, when I finished my union in 1993, at that point, I believe this is true, I think there still had never been an openly gay man hired into a tenure track position in the field of religion. But I was on the job market, and that presented an obstacle at several places where I was a candidate, some subtly, some explicitly. But I was very fortunate. I did get hired at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. So I began there in the fall of 1993, teaching the philosophy and religion program. And that allowed me a couple different things. It gave me an institutional base. I continued to take trips to Central America now with college students. I would take one trip every year, but with Drake students back there. I also got very involved in the religion and ecology section of the American Academy of Religion. And that was where a lot of, I met, I'd known Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm for a number of years, but became much more involved with them. Became a co-chair of that thing with Stephanie Kaza. several other people. And so it was during that time that Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm started the Religion and Ecology series of conferences that they did at Harvard and producing the books there. And so I stayed in touch with them through the Religion and Ecology section there. And I'll just to move forward here. Then I had an opportunity to have a sabbatical year in Montana, which I'd always loved, in the year 2000. During that year, I met an extraordinary man named Pat Burke, who's now my husband of 22 years. And, I should say we have a 15-year courtship, and now we have 7 years of legal marriage since it finally got legalized in 2015. But during all that time, I moved from geology now into ethics and theology, but my background in the natural science really linked me to continue to integrate those things. And the thing, I'll bring this background to a little bit of Journey of the Universe, and then we can move on to the other questions here. One of the reasons why I love geology is for me, at least, it's built on an experience of wonder, just wonder at the planet here. Because of my geology experience, the notion of deep time had resonated with me for a long time, but it really was kind of more of a conceptual framework for understanding geology. It wasn't really an existential framework at that point. And what I loved about the Forum on Religion and Ecology and the Journey of the Universe movement was beginning to integrate the scientific story with kind of an existential story about who are we in this universe story and why does that matter. And so Mary Evelyn Tucker and John were really gracious and invited me to be part of those conversations. And then was so delighted in March of 2011, they invited me to be part for the premiere of the initial showing of the Journey of the Universe film. And by that time, I was now teaching as a professor of environmental studies at Montana. And I just decided, I taught the basic intro course to our environmental studies was a course called Nature and Society that explored the relationship between human societies and nature over time and how that has mutually shaped each other. And I just found I started using Journey of the Universe, both the book and the film, as the very first thing we did in that course. And so students would oftentimes say, well, why are we starting with a look at the universe and a course on nature and society? And what I wanted to say is that what I would talk about is that both nature and human societies are part of the universe. We've evolved out of this universe and we're deeply influenced by that. So I would always hold my hands up in a big Y and say, we're going to start really, really broad, and we're going to keep narrowing it down until we get to where we are today. But Journey of the Universe proved to be just a fantastic way to start that course and frame that course. And what it meant was that almost all of our environmental studies students, as they began that program at the University of Montana, this was their introduction to the field. And so Journey of the Universe now, for about the 12 years I've been using it, has been the framework for all of our environmental studies students about what it means to think about issues of the environment and their interaction with human cultures, and then how and why that's part of an evolving universe story. So it's a very long-winded response to your question, Sam, but I hope that'll get us up to frame some of the other conversation here.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing such richness from your own life journey. And there's so much I want to ask you about, but maybe we can pick up on that experience of bringing Journey of the Universe into your teaching, because I'm curious about your interdisciplinary work in environmental studies, so inspired by the justice lens you're using in your teaching. And I'm curious, how have students responded to Journey of the Universe and this experience of watching a film and being initiated into this deep time perspective?
No, I think for the most part, they have responded with great enthusiasm and really delight at that. Again, oftentimes kind of initially with a little bit of a puzzle. Why are we talking about the universe in this story in this course called Nature and Society? But I'll back up for one moment here. And one of the things that frustrated me sometimes in my graduate studies in theology and ethics was that people were passionate about human society, human social justice, but oftentimes quite illiterate about actual science and about how the world functions there. And so, particularly in the field of environmental science, environmental ethics, I have a strong conviction that if we're going to be pontificating about what we should be doing with respect to the environment, we really need to have some understanding about how the world functions, because geology does that. And then this is where the notion of deep time, I think, is just so critical in that. Because there's a wonderful book that I've been using in recent years by Marcia Bjornerud called Timefulness. And she's a geology professor at Lawrence University in Wisconsin, but she also was an English major in college. And so she writes beautifully. And she says one of the big problems we've encountered in the world today is time illiteracy. that people just simply don't understand the role of time and how time, especially deep time, has shaped our world in such profound ways. And so this notion of deep time helps us understand how we've gotten to where we are, helps understand where we are today, but also particularly what are the options for moving forward. And so on a course in nature and society, I really wanted my students to engage with these big questions right off the bat. You know, how have we emerged out of an evolving universe, and why is that important? What features do we share with that universe story, and what does it mean for us today in terms of as we move out of one geological area, the Holocene, and into a new geological area, the Anthropocene, where now human beings are a planetary geological force, and to sort of use that. So I would start with Journey to the Universe, and then the very next week we read a little novel called Ishmael by Daniel Quinn, which would then, it was these conversations between a gorilla and a man that would raise all these issues about human culture and the cultural biases you have. And so with that framework, then we would start going into the history of the human interaction between human societies all over the world and their interaction with the natural world, how that shaped each other. But we had framed it now both within a kind of a deep time scientific framework, and also a kind of a pressing ethical issues framework. And then we go to the historical overview. And students just loved it. They just responded to it. I think reading the book in combination with the film was a great way to approach this, because the book is deceptively simple appearing as you read it. The writing is very clear. It covers a lot of territory, but you can kind of read through it quickly and not always be paying attention to it. But the film is so visually stunning so we would read them together. Read the film and read the book and watch the film together, and then have discussion sections on that, which would allow me to bring out what I consider to be some of the really key features in the film and the book. And it just worked beautifully to do it. I've used that Journey to the Universe in lots of other settings as well, in workshops in churches and other places where I'm talking about deep time. But the primary place I've used is in my classrooms. And I taught a graduate class called The Greening of Religion for a number of years. And I also used Journey to the Universe in that class there, and found it with graduate students, it was equally profound in terms of how it's shaping those conversations. So it's been just an absolutely wonderful vehicle to do this.
Absolutely. I'd love to see how different communities respond to this deep time perspective and enter into the universe story from these very unique lenses. Just last night, I was at a great Flaring Fourth celebration, celebrating Brian Thomas's swims, forthcoming what he calls an Autobiocosmology, his story of being initiated to an evolving and expanding universe and seeing his own place in that larger story. So I think that's such a gift to your students, that you've created space for them to see themselves in connection to these larger biological, chemical, and geologic processes that gave rise to life. And
it's I'm glad you mentioned about Brian Swim's autobiographical approach, because one of the things I've done is have them, after we read and watch the film, then write a short essay that just tries to connect some of their own life experience to what they're learning about that. And most of them have never thought about that before. It just hasn't been part of their kind of radar screen. So it's kind of a brand new way to sort of think about their own life as coming out of and being connected to something so much larger and so much grander that way. One of the things that they always respond to, there's so many different things in the book that they respond to. When Brian Swim does that wonderful illustration about the time in which the universe evolves there, and if it had gone just a tiny bit slower, a tiny bit faster, it wouldn't have. Then he uses the blowing up the balloon and then pricks it there. That just blows them away. And then I often would talk about them and say, now think about the molecules in your own body. All of us have molecules that once were part of dinosaurs. We're part, atoms that were part of these great stars, that notion that we're stardust and stuff, and that we're in continuity with all the life that's come before us and all the different parts of the planet. And that, and I would bring in a rock there and just say, each one of these rocks is a creation story. It has a story to tell us about that. And so to try to help them just to begin to read the world around them in a much more dynamic sense. Here in Missoula, it's Missoula, Montana. One of the really wonderful is we have right above the campus, there are all the old strand lines, the old beach lines for Glacial Lake Missoula, where we were during the Pleistocene. We were in one of these deep glacial lakes several times there. And so we can walk outside and just point to the features around us and help them begin to understand that this is not a static Earth. It's not just a static stage on which the human drama takes place, but actually it's a dynamic evolving, living Earth, part of a living solar system, part of a living universe, and that we are part of that as well. And so just trying to help them reshape their framing of that and then locate their own story within that.
I think Thomas Berry said that every being is telling its own story in some ways. And I think finding the stories contained in rocks is such a powerful insight. I'm reminded of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin or Warren Isley as, figures who are sort of helping to excavate these stories from even the lithosphere of the earth itself.
And it's one of the wonderful things too, being here in Montana, we have many different indigenous peoples who are native to this area and are still very present in the state and on the University of Montana campus increasingly so. And that's one of the places, I think one of the real gifts of indigenous peoples is I was taught that rocks are inanimate without soul. They're just passive, things like that. You can break a rock open and not worry about things like that. Indigenous people see the world so differently. They see it, and animus all over the world see it as imbued with spirit, imbued with knowledge, and so the landscape itself, there isn't that bifurcation between inanimate and animate. The whole landscape is a living landscape of which we need to have respect on that. And so, I'm still a Western trained geological scientist. I'll still go to an outcrop and take my rock hammer out and break some rocks and get my hand lens out and try to understand the geology in there. But to also understand it as a living landscape with its own story of which we're a part, and to be respectful towards that, I think helps us begin to frame differently the kind of very urgent current issues that we face in that as well.
I had some interesting conversations with Ursula Goodenough in a previous episode about animacy in the natural world and what constitutes a living being. But am I right in sensing that you're bringing us into the sensibility of living systems? I mean, would you consider rocks in the lithosphere to be alive or life generating? How do you, are those bifurcations of animate and inanimate, do you find them helpful or problematic? Yeah.
They can be both. I mean, I do find that, that classifications and definitions that as kind of heuristic concepts that help us understand things can be really important. It's when they become reified that I think becomes so problematic. So for example, I think it's perfectly fine to look at what makes human beings distinctive from other forms of life, as long as we also understand what continuity we have with other forms of life. And so I'll give you one example, then I'll come back to the rocks here. There's a great caution oftentimes about anthropomorphizing, projecting human qualities onto other forms of animals there in a way that kind of keeps us separate from other forms of animals. And I say, I think that's the bigger risk, is that we don't mammalize enough. We don't look at the other mammals, whether it's a blue whale or a wolf and things like that, and say, what do we have in common as mammals? How can these other forms of mammal life help us understand our qualities as mammals? And so it's not just what is distinctive, it's what we have in common across these here. And the same thing between what's particularly seen as living versus non-living, or animate versus non-animate. That's an important distinction for some areas there, but they all are energy systems. They all contain these vibrant different amounts of energy and different kind of energy states, whether it's a rock that's 4.2 billion years old or a recently formed amoeba. They still, there's on this continuity. And that's again what I think that Brian Swimme does narrate so beautifully in the journey of the universe, is this from the very, very origins of the great flaring forth of the Big Bang. There's been this differentiation of energy and matter in all these different configurations, and it's constantly moving towards greater and greater diversity of forms, greater complexity, greater creativity in that. And so I have a talk that I give to several different folks there where I try to bring some of this together, called Deep Time, Climate Change, and Mass Extinctions, but kind of it helps introduce people to understanding of deep time, and that the Earth has a history, and then this history of life evolving in the Earth, but it's not a simple straight line evolution. It's complex there, with these periods of incredible suffering and death and extinctions, but also recovery of life there. And of course, the continuity across that between these different energy systems as well is really important. And so it's again trying to take the concepts, the conceptual framework that we all inherited through our education, our Western culture, things like that, but then to kind of complexify it, to really help it to think more creatively about how can we still use those concepts, because they're very, very powerful, but not have them become so reified that we lose the access to the mystery and the diversity and the greater creativity of that. And there, I'm always drawn to some of the insights of ecologists who say that that what ecology teaches us not only that that the world is more complex than we can understand, but it's so much more complex. We can understand a lot of it, but what that complexity teaches us, we'll never understand it fully. And that should imbue us with a sense of humility then in terms of where we're doing there. For me, geology in deep time does the same thing. To immerse yourself in that story can't help but kind of decenter our human-centric focus on so many things, because we're such a tiny, tiny part in terms of the time story about that. And yes, an incredibly potent part of that story, and one that can be triggering, what maybe the 6 great extinction events. So holding on to that tension between those two ends there is really important for me.
I'm curious to hear more, in light of mass extinction and some of these great environmental challenges we're facing, to hear a little more about your hands-on restoration ecology work across Montana and Colorado, and what you've done in these bioregions to help restore native biodiversity. And if you have any comments as well about tribal sovereignty, about rights of indigenous peoples in your region.
Well, that's a wonderful question, Sam, and thank you for that here. One of the things that I learned early on 30 years ago, starting to teach environmental issues, is we sometimes joke that environmental studies is the most depressing major on campus, because we just confront our students with these incredibly complex, difficult global problems. And so much of it can feel like just a parade of bad news events there. And so it becomes really important so that we're not just inculcating despair, but they're actually teaching, getting greater agency about how we respond, that we find the places where positive things are happening. And the field of ecological restoration is one of those for me. Ironically, I got started in the field of restoration while I was living in Iowa. I moved to Iowa in 1993, and I had never lived in a prairie, area that had evolved in the tallgrass prairie. I'm from the West. I'm imbued with mountain landscapes, and Iowa was so different. And so I was trying to find a way to make it more tangible with me. And just outside of Des Moines to the east is one of the world's largest tallgrass prairie restoration projects there, the Neil Smith Prairie Reserve. And it was a very ambitious project where they were taking nearly 9,000 acres of what had been monocrop farmland. It had originally been tallgrass prairie, had been turned over for 150 years and cultivated as farmland, and now was being returned to native prairie through the act of ecological restoration. And I just got fascinated with this because Iowa, in terms of surface area, is the most ecologically altered state in the nation. Virtually the entire state was tallgrass prairie, and it's almost all monocrop agriculture now of corn and soybeans. And so the largest native prairie that's been undisturbed in Iowa is under 100 acres. It's just tiny little postage stamps there. But here was this effort to try to bring back the tallgrass prairie through active restoration. And so started taking students out there, doing projects on that, became really interested in that. And then when I came out to Montana for a sabbatical year 2000, I met my partner and husband, Pat Burke, who was a restoration ecologist. He had a company called Bitterroot Restoration that was actively going around the West and trying to do ecological restoration of usually disturbed mining sites, but lots of other areas as well. And then I became really interested in the role of fire in that. Fire is a natural process and how fire can do that. So I started teaching a course called Ethics, Fire, and Wilderness, looking at the role of fire and wilderness and the role of ecological restoration and restoring ecosystems there. But what I began to find was that as I involved my students in doing hands-on restoration projects there, it began to really help them build agency. First of all, they just loved getting their hands dirty and doing the actual work there, but also we could see that you're making a positive impact. So here's human agency making a positive effect on the landscape. For example, my graduate students, we'll go out each fall and we'll build what are called BDAs, or beaver dam analogs, in places in stream systems where the beavers were native, but they've been eliminated. But we can bring back these imitation beaver dams, and it reshapes the streams and reconnects them to their floodplain. And it's just suddenly within a few years, you've got a completely different stream system there. And you can see the effects from year to year so quickly. So to get students involved in ecological restoration and realizing we can now use these tools of science and tools of ecology to restore the damage that's been done by human actions there. And so Missoula is actually the downstream end of the country's largest Superfund site. From here all the way up to Butte, Montana, about 115 miles upstream on the Clark Fork River. The whole thing is a Superfund site because of the outwash of mine tailings over the years there. And so I build my graduate class called Ethics and the Ethical Issues in Ecological Restoration. We build it around our watershed, the Clark Fork River watershed, and we get involved in these different acts of restoration in that. And it's just very empowering to see now the way we're able to bring ecosystems back to a much healthier state. Now, one of the most exciting parts of that, and you mentioned, you asked about the relation with indigenous peoples, is some of the indigenous tribes in Montana have been real leaders in this. Particularly just north of Missoula is the Flathead Reservation, where the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes live. And I got involved in a restoration on the Jocko River that was being spearheaded by the Salish tribes there, because they wanted to do ecological restoration of the Jocko River to bring back the bull trout. The bull trout is the largest native trout species in this area here, but it's been threatened for all sorts of different reasons of introduced competitor species and contaminated streams and so forth. And so it's a threatened species now in the state, but it's a sacred fish to the Salish. And so what became extraordinary about this effort to restore the Jocko Restoration River was, from the very beginning, the Salish saw this as not only ecological restoration, but cultural and spiritual restoration. And so I talk about it as a holistic restoration. And from the very beginning, they decided they were going to use this restoration as a way of inculcating this ethics of respect to the children. So they built a whole curriculum around clean water and ecological restoration of the rivers there. And they have every year, they have a 3-day event called Honor the River, where they bring school children from across the reservation, indigenous and non-indigenous children alike, for 3 days to have them talk to the elders about the importance of water, the importance of fish, the importance of rivers, and then they participate in some of the cleanup efforts there. So this is one of the things I have my graduate students do is to write an ethic of restoration. And how do we involve ourselves in that? What does it mean to be seeing ourselves as restorative agents in a world, as ecologists say, a world of wounds or a world of damage on that? But for me, it's been really important to see this as a kind of a holistic dimension, that it's not just a kind of a mechanical act of going out and using steam shovels and so forth to dig up contaminated earth and restore that there. But we use this slogan about, when we restore the earth, we restore ourselves to the earth. We become agents as part of that restoration. And so I interweave ecological restoration with my graduate studies in greening of religion as well, in terms of, again, seeing about how can we use the praxis of restoration to be part of this greening, not only religion, but regreening the earth that's been damaged in that.
Again, so inspiring to see how you're empowering students to be agents in ecological restoration and to see themselves, again, as participants in this larger, earth and universe story. And I'm curious also on a larger scale, Dan, we're in the midst of COP27 now in Egypt and these ongoing climate negotiations at this really critical historical juncture, trying to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming by 2030, and these really trying to meet these ambitious climate targets. I'm curious to hear your take of the state of our climate and what needs to happen at this particular moment.
Well, there's a few different things, Sam. That's a really important question about that. And I was really fortunate that my partner, Pat, and I were able to be observers at COP24 in Katowice, Poland, 4 years ago. And so to be able to experience the inside of that conference there and get some insights from that has been really helpful. There's so many different things to be thinking about in terms of that. I was very fortunate that because I spent time studying in Latin America on liberation theology and social justice issues, but I went there as a geologist. For me, I've always tried to link the ecological and the environmental dimensions with the social justice dimensions. And so climate justice, environmental justice, eco-justice, environmental racism, those things have emerged as such important understandings and frameworks to shape our praxis, and to not separate social justice issues from environmental issues, but they're impacted together. And of course, what's going on, and one of the really critical things going on in COP27 is this really critical issue about who bears primary responsibility for the damage to the atmosphere, for the climate change that's happening here. And of course, the primary polluters in the last two centuries have been the nations of the so-called developed world now, or the North Atlantic nations, the United States, Europe, but increasingly nations like China and India are contributing that as well here. But if we look historically, who bears primary responsibility for climate change, it's quite clear. It's the nations that went through the Industrial Revolution and revolutionized their own economies, and that chiefly the United States, but also Western Europe. But unfortunately, the main impacts of climate change that are already sweeping our planet are happening primarily against poor nations there that don't have the resources. So if you look at for example, the incredible flooding in Pakistan this summer, that just unbelievable climate change flooding there, damaging so many people there. But these kinds of climate change events are happening all over the world. For a decade now, I've been taking students to the Mekong Delta in Vietnam to look at climate change impacts there and also what they're trying to do to mitigate that. But here's an area of 22 million people. That's the size about 1/6 or 1/7 the size of my state of Montana. And yet that area there, the highest point above land is about 2 meters, about 6 to 7 feet above sea level. So sea level rise really has quite potential of simply eliminating that whole area within the next 30 or 40 years. And so these are not theoretical issues there. And yet, Vietnam historically has been one of the poorest nations there. How they've had very little contribution to climate change, but they're bearing the brunt of it, as are countries like Bangladesh or countries of sub-Saharan Africa where the heat is, the weather's changing. So this raises a really important moral issue about, that's central to environmental justice questions, is that we have always called about as the polluter pays principle. The person who is responsible, the agent responsible for that, should be responsible for providing the resources to clean it up. We see that in our Superfund law. We have, I mentioned that I'm involving my students in the restoration of the Clark Fork River. It's a Superfund site. The responsible party is Atlantic Richfield Company, which bought the former mining company there. And so by law, they are responsible for providing the funds for ameliorating and cleaning that up there. We unfortunately don't have a similar framework at the international level. We have the moral case that wealthy nations should be providing the funds for poor nations to be able to adapt to climate change there. And there have been a lot of commitments, but not always so much follow through on that here. So the issue that's being raised at COP27, I think, is absolutely critical to climate justice and to really resolving these issues. And it becomes quite clear it's not only, it's a matter of self-interest as well. If poorer nations are not given the resources to help resolve this there, then they will be forced into continuing to use very highly polluting waste there and will only contribute to the global climate crisis that all of us are threatened by. But it's very difficult to motivate wealthy countries to provide the resources that are needed for this here. So it's a critical issue. I wish I felt more optimistic or hopeful about that than I currently do. I think it's the conversations and discussions are so critical. But I'll go back to one of the things I said before about timefulness that Marshall Bjornary talks about. We have, on the one hand, we have deep time, which is enormous time. We're talking about a millions of year kind of time. On the other hand, we have this urgency of the fact that climate can move very, very quickly to these irreversible tipping points on there. And so there's a real urgency that if we don't resolve these issues in the next decade or so there, we are more than likely going to pass by these tipping points that are nonlinear to the climate change. And then we get into global feedback systems there, which are going to be probably irreversible, at least in the scale of human lifetimes on that. And yet our political leaders don't seem to really be able to grasp that the urgency of the time there and what that's going to require for a change here. And so, 2 days ago was November 8th, these elections, and now that I'm retired, I got to work as an election judge on that here. But it's quite clear that at least one of the houses of Congress is probably going to be now headed by the Republicans, which is going to bring any further legislative action on climate change to a halt. On there, I think one of the real tragedies of our system is that somehow climate change became a partisan issue. It didn't used to be. It used to be a bipartisan issue in this country, but now it's a partisan issue, which means it's just very, very difficult at the federal level to get any bipartisan action to address climate change. And yet, the climate systems don't care. They're working on their own time scale, their own time urgency, and all that. So I oftentimes say to my students, if you look at the history of the Earth and the history of mass extinctions, the life will continue in some form or not. We don't have the power to extinguish life on this planet. But we do have the power, unfortunately, to extinguish many, many different forms of life. And so the question becomes, do we want to continue to be part of this life journey? And do we want the other plants and animals that are our companions to be there as part of that as well? And that's very sobering right now, because we just don't seem to be able to address the climate urgency with this kind of policy issues that need to take place in here. I'll say one other thing, Sam, and then we can move along here. But I taught for many years a course called Globalization, Justice, and the Environment. And part of what I wanted my students to understand was the kind of what I would call the architecture of the global economy, how the World Trade Organization, how the International Monetary Fund, how the World Bank, how these global economic institutions shape that economy there. But one of the big differences there is those global institutions have enforcement power. If you violate something in the World Bank can take action against you that makes your country step in line. The same thing, the International Monetary Fund. So there's the countries of the world, in order to be part of this global economy, have ceded some of their political autonomy to those global institutions in response to get the benefit from it. But that means that and so you see this oftentimes happen. The World Bank or the IMF will take out sanctions against a country to change its behaviors, and the countries usually change their behaviors. Unfortunately, we don't have a similar regime for environmental issues, for climate change issues. It's the United Nations is a voluntary framework, and so we can come up with voluntary agreements. And so, like the Paris Accords, incredibly important, but they still require their voluntary commitments there. And what happens, when you have the Ukraine situation here and rising energy costs and economic problems, it just makes it very difficult to keep those commitments going in the face of what are perceived as much more important short-term emergencies. But then the clock continues to tick on climate change, and so it's very sobering if you think back to 30 years ago when we were looking in the 1992 Accords, and Al Gore was important. We signed those things there in Japan. And yet the Kyoto Accords, if you look at the amount of carbon that has been put in the atmosphere in the 30 years since, we just have, we failed. And so I don't want to, sound too pessimistic, because I think it's so important we continue to work on these things here, but it's difficult to be optimistic. One could be hopeful, but I don't think there's much room for optimism right now.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction of optimism versus hope, and not falling into kind of naive optimism, but hopeful participatory action, which is, certainly the consciousness we're trying to raise as part of the Journey of the Universe project. And, here affiliated with the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, trying to mobilize grassroots environmental leadership around the world in support of these initiatives at COP27 and other places.
Well, let me use one other just a parallel from my own story about that. I think is so important about that, because again, the last thing I want to do is say anything that's going to father either complacency or depression or things like that, because agency is all we have. And hope is so important on that here. Mm-hmm. And yet, one of the things I've learned over the course of my lifetime is these kind of grassroots efforts are so critical, because they're oftentimes taking place below the radar screen, and yet you can never really predict when you're going to hit a tipping point, but sometimes you hit tipping points and you go to the other side on that. And I'll use my own example of being gay. I never, during all of my lifetime growing up, it was just inconceivable to me that I would ever be able to legally marry my partner, Pat. It just, there was just nothing that happened there. And yet slowly, it's a slow accumulation, over from the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s like that, of lots of people coming out, or lots of little grassroots change there. And we hit a tipping point in 2015 with the Supreme Court decision. And what's astonishing now is to see how quickly U.S. attitudes towards same-sex marriage have changed. It's now accepted by 75 or 80% of the country here. And so there's still political peril. There's still, the courts can undo that. But the attitudes have changed so much. And that's a non-linear tipping point. We went from someone like President Obama opposing same-sex marriage and most of the country opposing it, to 10 years later, less than 10 years later, being legalized and now being accepted as part of the cultural norm. And so tipping points don't only happen in climate change systems, they happen in cultures too. And so the grassroots work that's been done, and that's whether it's Greta Thunberg mobilizing the youth, or the Forum on Religion and Ecology doing the incredible work, all these things make such an incredible thing. And so my hope is that we'll just keep doing that, and then we'll hit a tipping point where we move into the really active agency on that there. So I don't want to sound too gloom and doom, but the other thing I would say is that the international conferences like the COP27 going on right now, the only way they're going to succeed is if there's a lot of grassroots activism and pressure to keep them going in the participating countries there. And that's where the grassroots efforts are so critically important.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that really uplifting and tangible example of social justice and how that can, those grassroots movements can truly change cultures for the better. As we come to a close here, Dan, do you have any parting message you want to share with our global audience here with the Journey of the Universe project?
I guess I hope it doesn't sound too sappy or not, but I talked before about one of the things that I love about the Journey of the Universe and the whole story is it's born in wonder, and this notion, and I've just always loved our planet and the wonder it evokes in terms of the beautiful complexity of the both life, but also the geological story and things like that. But that in turn evokes gratitude, and just what I would call deep gratitude, this sense of just deep gratitude for being here in this place and time, being able to work on this here. And I would just say my deep gratitude to Mary Evelyn Tucker, to John Grimm, to Brian Swim, to everybody who's been associated with the Journey of the Universe project with the Forum on Religion and Ecology, because it's such vital work. And I have seen time and again how people are hungry for this kind of story and hungry for seeing themselves as part of this story. And one of the things that Journey of the Universe reminds ourselves is that it's easy sometimes for me to think of the human species as being not part of this earth, because we don't play by the rules well sometimes in terms of the earth story here. But Journey of the Universe reminds you, no, we are deeply embedded in this earth story. In fact, we are part of the universe story. And that wonderful notion that we're now that part of the universe that can reflect back on itself and take responsibility for its actions there. And as far as we know, at least our corner of the universe, that's distinctive. That's located in us on this planet here. And so it's a big responsibility, but it's also something for which to be deeply grateful. So I have 3 grandchildren now, and I just adore them, and they are going to live their lives probably entirely within the 21st century. So the actions and decisions and things that I'm trying to do today are shaping them and the children that they're going to grow up with, and the future generations. So I just try to keep that in mind here. I'm so deeply grateful for my grandkids. I'm deeply grateful for the planet they live on, but I want to do my best to make sure it continues to be a habitable planet for them and then our more than human companions there as well. So that's probably the last thing I could say.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for joining us today, for all the amazing work you're doing in Montana and throughout the West. And I look forward to staying connected in our parallel journeys.
Hey, come back to the Bob Marshall Wilderness. We'll go hiking together sometime, Sam.
I would love that. I would love that, Dan. What a gift that would be. All right.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Good luck with your work.
Thank you.